At 6:40 in the morning, while Rome was still dark enough for the street lamps to look like small, trembling candles, a cream-colored folder crossed the threshold of the papal study. It was not carried by a cardinal. It was not announced by the press office. It was not placed on the Vatican calendar. A young Monsignor from the Secretariat of State entered with both hands on the file, as if he were carrying something fragile, dangerous, or already burning. A red cord held the pages together. The seal had been pressed hard enough into the wax to leave a clean wound. Across the front, in black ink, were 3 Latin words: Pactum Unitatis, the Pact of Unity. Pope Leo XIV looked at the folder for a long time before he touched it. On the desk beside it sat a cold cup of coffee, a worn rosary from Peru, and a small Latin missal whose pages had been softened by use. Under the missal was another object, almost hidden, a folded letter from a young Catholic who had not been inside a church for 4 years because, as he wrote, I was told there was no room for someone like me unless I became invisible. The Pope placed one hand on the missal and one hand on the letter. Then he whispered, not to the Monsignor, not to the room, but to the crucifix above the desk. Lord, do not let me choose a faction when you died for a body. By noon, the folder would leave the study. By evening, it would divide bishops, ignite Catholic media, fill St. Peter's Square with prayer, and force Catholics, who had spent years calling one another enemies, to ask a question they had avoided for too long. Can a church remember her ancient soul without closing her doors to wounded children? Or had the wound already become too deep? Before we go further, remember what this story is: a dramatized Vatican-style documentary scenario written in the language of ecclesial crisis, spiritual conflict, and Catholic imagination. It is not a verified news report. It is a narrative built to explore what happens when a pope tries to hold together 2 worlds that no longer know how to speak. And the reason it matters is simple. The Pact of Unity did not begin as a document. It began as a wound. To understand why one cream-colored folder could shake the Vatican, we have to go back to the years before it appeared on Leo XIV's desk. For a long time, the Church had been living through 2 separate wars. The first war was fought around the altar. For some Catholics, the traditional Latin Mass was not a preference. It was a homeland. It was the silence before the first note of chant. It was the smell of wax and incense. It was the old prayers, the bowed head, the kneeling body, the sense that the Church had not been invented yesterday and would not disappear tomorrow. They spoke of reverence, continuity, sacrifice, mystery. They spoke of grandparents who had carried that form of worship like a family inheritance. But in many dioceses, those Catholics felt watched, suspected, restricted, moved to inconvenient hours, told that attachment to the ancient liturgy was dangerous, divisive, anti-conciliar, or spiritually immature. Some communities were healthy, some were proud and wounded, some had indeed become bitter, but many were simply faithful people who had found God in sacred silence and could not understand why their love was treated as rebellion. One elderly priest from France wrote to Rome, I have buried 3 generations of Catholics. I have baptized their children and visited their sick. Now they tell my people that the Mass that taught them how to kneel is a threat. Holy Father, what did we do wrong? That letter would later sit in Leo XIV's black notebook, under the heading, Memory. The Second War was fought outside the doors. There were Catholics who had not left the Church, but had been made to feel that the Church had already left them. LGBT Catholics, who still prayed in secret but feared confession because they expected humiliation before mercy. Women who had carried parishes on their backs for decades, teaching children, caring for the poor, organizing funerals, preparing liturgies, and yet felt invisible whenever decisions were made. Divorced and remarried Catholics who sat in the back pews with complicated lives and unanswered questions. Survivors of abuse who could not hear the phrase, trust the Church, without feeling their stomach tighten. Young people who loved Jesus, but could not understand why every difficult question had seemed to be treated as an attack. Many of them were not demanding that doctrine vanish. They were asking for a face. They were asking for a chair. They were asking to be heard before being corrected, accompanied before being classified, loved before being explained. A woman from Argentina wrote, I do not ask Rome to approve everything I have done. I ask Rome to stop speaking of people like me as though we are problems and not daughters." That letter sat in the same notebook under another heading, Door. For years, those two wounds almost never touched. Traditional Catholics had their conferences, their podcasts, their Latin missals, their rosary crusades, their language of fidelity and betrayal. Progressive Catholics had their listening sessions, their pastoral networks, their letters about inclusion, their language of dignity and exclusion. Each side believed the other represented the future collapse of the Church. Traditionalists feared a church that would exchange truth for applause. Progressives feared a church that would exchange mercy for nostalgia. Both claimed to defend Christ. Both had real wounds. Both had real blind spots. And both had learned how to speak about the other side without ever sitting in the same room long enough to hear pain beneath anger. When Pope Leo XIV was elected, every faction tried to read him like a weather report. Traditionalists studied his liturgical gestures. Would he kneel longer? Would he wear older vestments? Would he speak of continuity? Would he correct what they called the exile of the Latin Mass? Progressives studied his pastoral language. Would he say, "Welcome"? Would he listen to the margins? Would he expand lay participation? Would he allow wounded Catholics to speak without being framed as threats? The Curia studied something else. Would he delay? Because delay had become a form of government. Delay could look prudent. Delay could be dressed as discernment. Delay could keep everyone angry but contained. A commission here, a study there, a consultation that never ended, a clarification that clarified nothing. In Rome, delay was sometimes not weakness. It was technique. But Leo XIV had been formed far from the velvet language of Vatican survival. In the villages of Peru, he had learned that wounds do not heal because committees admire them. He had seen people bleed through the night while authorities debated jurisdiction. He had heard mothers say, "Father, I do not need a process. I need someone to look at my child." So, in his first months, he did something that made the bureaucracy uneasy. He listened outside the usual channels. The meetings began in a small room near Santa Marta. No cameras, no official minutes, no press release. A wooden table, 12 chairs, a crucifix, a pitcher of water. The first group included 3 priests attached to the traditional Latin Mass, 2 young laywomen who attended the old rite, a bishop who had restricted it in his diocese, and a canon lawyer assigned to observe. Leo asked them one question. "What are you afraid of losing?" For 40 minutes, the answer came in layers. They were afraid of losing beauty, losing silence, losing continuity, losing the sense that the Church had received worship rather than invented it, losing spiritual fathers who understood sacrifice, losing children to a world of noise, losing the right to love what their ancestors loved. Then, one of the young women, wearing a simple veil, said something that made the Pope put down his pen. "Holy Father, I do not go to the Latin Mass because I hate anyone. I go because there I can finally stop performing and simply kneel." Leo wrote in his notebook, "Stop performing." The next day another group came, a lesbian Catholic from Spain who had stopped receiving communion but still prayed the liturgy of the hours every morning. A woman theologian from Brazil. A divorced father from the United States who said his parish had treated him like a warning sign. A survivor from Ireland. A young Filipino Catholic who had served in parish ministry for years but said he was tired of being welcomed in theory and avoided in practice. Leo asked the same question. What are you afraid of losing? The answers were different, but not entirely. They were afraid of losing belonging, losing faith, losing children, losing the courage to enter the Church, losing the image of God, because the faces representing God had been cold, losing the ability to pray without feeling like a case file. The survivor spoke last. "I am not asking the Church to become whatever I want," she said. "I am asking the Church to stop asking the wounded to wait until the comfortable are ready." Leo wrote, "Wounded cannot wait forever." In later sessions, when voices hardened and accusations began, the Pope would raise his hand and say the sentence that would eventually pass from one Vatican corridor to another. "Tell me where it hurts, not who you hate." That sentence became the seed of the pact. For weeks, the Pope filled notebooks. Not policy drafts, not slogans, names, sentences, tears, contradictions. He wrote down the traditional priest who said beauty had been treated as extremism. He wrote down the LGBT Catholic who said mercy had been treated as suspicion. He wrote down the bishop who feared chaos. He wrote down the mother who said her 2 sons had taken opposite sides of the liturgy war and now no longer spoke. At night, he arranged the pages into 2 piles. Memory, wound. At first, his advisors expected a pastoral letter, something broad, something moving, something safe enough for everyone to quote selectively. But Leo XIV did not want another text people could weaponize without changing. He wanted obligations. He wanted diocesan consequences. He wanted bishops to stop hiding behind the sentence, "Rome has not instructed us." And so the document grew teeth. The first draft was called Charter of Reconciliation. Leo rejected it. Too bureaucratic, he said. The second was called Decree for Ecclesial Peace. He rejected that too. Too triumphant, he said. There is no peace yet. A younger aide suggested the Church of all. Leo shook his head. Too political. The Church is not ours first. She is Christ's. Then, in the margin of a handwritten page, the Pope wrote 2 words. Pactum Unitatis, the Pact of Unity. A pact is not a slogan. A pact costs something. A pact means that 2 wounded sides stop using wounds as credentials for domination. A pact means memory must kneel before charity and reform must kneel before truth. A pact means no one gets to call victory the same thing as communion. The first section of the document addressed the traditional Latin Mass. The language was deliberate. The ancient Roman liturgy, the text said, was to be treated as a living inheritance of the Church, not a tolerated embarrassment. Every diocese would be expected to provide broad and stable access where there were faithful genuinely attached to it, under the authority of the bishop, but not at the mercy of ideological hostility. Bishops were instructed not to humiliate communities, not to exile them into invisibility, and not to assume that love for the old rite meant rejection of the Church. The document said, "The faithful who have found prayer in the ancient form of the Roman Rite must not be treated as suspects before being treated as children." For traditional Catholics, that line felt like rain after years of drought. But the same section contained a warning. The Latin Mass could not be used as a banner of rebellion, a weapon against the Pope, a theater of superiority, or the foundation of a parallel church. Priests celebrating it would be required to affirm communion with the bishop and the Roman pontiff. Catechesis would be required to ensure that love for the older form did not become contempt for the ordinary life of the Church. The document said, "No form of worship, however venerable, may become a sanctuary for disdain." That sentence enraged the militants, because Leo XIV had given them something real, and then taken away the right to use it as a fortress. The second section addressed Catholics who had experienced exclusion. Here the document was careful, but unflinching. It did not redefine sacramental doctrine. It did not erase moral teaching. It did not turn accompaniment into approval. But it required every diocese to create listening forums for those who had felt pushed to the margins. LGBT Catholics, divorced and remarried Catholics, women serving in pastoral leadership, survivors of abuse, young adults alienated from parish life, and lay Catholics who had been told for years to work but not speak. These forums would not be public relations exercises. They would include trained pastoral leaders, theologians, canonists, and lay witnesses. Reports would be sent to Rome. Bishops would be required to respond in writing to the wounds named in their dioceses. The key line read, "No son or daughter of the Church may be treated as a problem to be solved before being recognized as a soul to be loved." Those words detonated before the document was even formally presented. A translator who saw the line in advance reportedly stopped working and wept. A Vatican lawyer circled the sentence in red and wrote in the margin, "Implications extensive." A cardinal from Eastern Europe saw the same line and said, "This will be interpreted as surrender." Leo XIV answered, "Only by those who think love is surrender." The third section was the one the Curia feared most, because it moved from words to structures. Every diocese would be asked to establish pastoral reconciliation plans for communities divided by liturgical conflict. External financial audits would be encouraged and, in some cases, mandated for institutions seeking Vatican support. Abuse-related archives would be reviewed for partial release where legally and pastorally possible. Lay councils would receive expanded consultative authority. Women theologians and lay experts would be included in unity commissions. Survivors would have direct channels for testimony outside diocesan gatekeeping. This was no longer a symbolic bridge. It was architecture. And architecture threatens people who benefit from locked rooms. When the final draft was read aloud in a restricted meeting the night before publication, the reaction was cold. No one shouted. That would have been easier. Instead, there was Roman silence, polished, dangerous, full of calculations. Bipsup. Pasbimhan for me. Cardinal Fainata Abiete. Bakib Bapiso Pacum. Holy Father, you have combined matters that should remain distinct: liturgy, sexuality, abuse, finances, lay governance, women's participation. This is not a pact, it is a storm system. Leo XIV looked at him and replied, "They have never been separate in the lives of the faithful, only in our files." Another warned, "You will make both sides angry." The Pope nodded. Then perhaps both sides will have to ask whether they came for Christ or for conquest. That was the last meeting before the folder was sealed. And at 6:40 the next morning, it reached his desk. The announcement came 2 days later in the Clementine Hall. The hall looked the way it always looks when Rome wants to appear older than crisis. Marble, red chairs, gold frames, controlled lighting, faces trained into composure. The journalists were expecting a significant statement. They had heard rumors, but none of them knew the full scale. At exactly 11:03 the doors opened. Pope Leo XIV entered alone. He carried the pact himself. That small detail shifted the atmosphere. No secretary, no ceremonial handler, no official carrying the weight for him. He placed the cream folder on the lectern, untied the red cord, and let the silence stretch for 9 seconds. Then he said, "Today I give the people of God a pact, not because we agree on everything, but because we belong to one Lord." Pen stopped. Cameras adjusted. The Pope continued, "The Church cannot survive as a battlefield between memory and hope. The Church is not a museum for the frightened, and she is not a laboratory for the impatient. She is the body of Christ, and the body of Christ does not heal by amputating its own members." The first shock came when he read the Latin Mass provisions. A traditionalist bishop in the second row closed his eyes as if in thanksgiving. A young priest near the back wiped his face with his sleeve. One laywoman began silently praying the Salve Regina. Leo read, "The ancient Roman liturgy is not to be treated as an enemy of communion when celebrated in communion. It has nourished saints, formed families, and carried the faith through centuries of trial. Those who love it must be shepherded, not shamed." For 10 seconds the hall almost softened. Then he read the condition. No one may receive a treasure of the Church in order to turn it against the Church. The softness ended. The second shock came when he announced the listening forums. The Pope looked up from the page before reading the sentence. No son or daughter of the Church may be treated as a problem to be solved before being recognized as a soul to be loved. A woman theologian in the third row covered her mouth. A bishop from Africa leaned back, not angry, but alert. An Italian Monsignor wrote something quickly and underlined it twice. Leo continued, "The Church does not listen because she has no truth. She listens because truth became flesh and looked people in the eyes." That was the line that made the progressive Catholics weep and the cautious administrators sweat, because it was not sentimental. It was incarnational. Then the Pope read the governance provisions: audits, archives, lay councils, women experts, pastoral plans, survivor channels, diocesan obligations. The document had now moved beyond symbolic reconciliation. It was forcing a church of files to become a church of faces. At the end, Leo XIV closed the folder and said the sentence that would travel faster than the official text. "The Church will no longer be a battlefield. She will be a field hospital for the wounded soul." In St. Peter's Square, where the address was being broadcast on large screens, the reaction was immediate and contradictory. Some cheered, some knelt, some stared in disbelief. A young man, wearing a t-shirt with a traditionalist slogan, stood beside a woman holding a rainbow rosary. Neither spoke. Then the woman began crying. The young man, visibly uncomfortable, handed her a tissue. That photograph became one of the first images of the pact. Not agreement, not resolution, but proximity. By sunset, Catholic social media had become a storm. Pact of Unity. Latin Mass returns. Rome opens LGBT dialogue. Pope betrays tradition. Pope heals the Church. Schism watch. Pope of all. Rome has fallen. Rome has listened. The hashtags changed every hour, but the intensity did not. In Texas, a traditionalist community rang bells after receiving confirmation that their diocesan bishop would restore one public weekly Latin Mass. People who had felt exiled embraced in the parking lot. In California, an LGBT Catholic group gathered in a chapel basement and read the line about sons and daughters of the church. One man who had not entered a parish in years whispered, "I did not know I still wanted Rome to call me a son." In Poland, thousands gathered for rosaries of reparation, warning that Rome had opened the door to doctrinal confusion. In Spain, parish halls filled with people asking what listening would actually mean. In Nigeria, bishops issued cautious statements, welcoming unity, but asking for clarity about implementation in cultures where Western categories could not simply be imported. In the Philippines, families stayed up late watching analysis programs. A grandmother who loved the old Latin hymns sat beside her granddaughter, who had stopped attending Mass after a painful parish encounter. They watched the Pope together. At the end, the grandmother said, "Maybe we both have to come back differently." That sentence did not go viral, but it may have captured the pact better than any headline. Inside the Vatican, however, the mood was not tender. It was tactical. Within hours, 3 factions had formed. The first faction called the Pact a masterpiece of Catholic balance. It gave the wounded memory of tradition a place at the table, and it gave the wounded persons of the present a voice in the room. It did not let anyone become absolute. It forced communion. The second faction called it incoherent. They argued that liturgical restoration and pastoral inclusion belonged to different theological registers. They accused Leo of creating confusion by tying together topics that required separate treatment. They feared dioceses would implement only the parts they liked. The third faction said almost nothing. That was the one the Pope watched most carefully, because silence in Rome can mean prayer. It can also mean resistance. A memo began circulating privately under the title, "Necessary Clarifications Regarding Pactum Unitatis." It asked whether the document altered prior restrictions, whether bishops retained discretion, whether listening forums could influence doctrine, whether lay councils had binding force, whether women experts could review diocesan governance, and whether financial audits would apply retroactively. The questions were legitimate. The tone was not. A Vatican official close to Leo described it as delay dressed as concern. The Pope read the memo late that night. He placed it beside the letters from the listening sessions. Then he drew 2 columns in his notebook. Questions that seek truth, questions that seek escape. He wrote under the second column, "Watch closely." The next morning he did something unexpected. He announced a Mass for all the children of the Church. Not for the Pact, not for unity as a slogan, for all the children. The basilica filled before dawn. Traditional Catholics arrived early, carrying hand missals and rosaries, many dressed with a solemnity that seemed almost like armor. Progressive Catholics came quietly, unsure whether they were being welcomed or displayed. Survivors came, families came, religious sisters came, seminarians came with faces full of curiosity and fear. Journalists filled every assigned space. The entrance chant was Gregorian. The Kyrie rose through St. Peter's like smoke from another century. The ancient sound filled the dome and moved down the marble columns. Some wept immediately. For traditional Catholics, it felt as if a door long closed had opened again. Then came the readings. The first was proclaimed by a laywoman who had served in diocesan pastoral work for 30 years. The second was proclaimed by a young Catholic who had once written to the Pope about being humiliated in a parish and leaving the church for half a decade. The prayers of the faithful included petitions for those attached to the ancient liturgy, for those who had felt excluded, for bishops afraid of conflict, for survivors of abuse, for families divided by ideology, for priests tempted by contempt, and for reformers tempted by arrogance. The basilica felt like a heart under strain, held together, but under strain. In his homily, Leo XIV spoke for only 8 minutes. He did not defend the document. He did not explain the provisions. He simply looked at the assembly and said, "No one loses their place in the Father's house because another wounded child returns." He paused. The house is not smaller because the old prayer is sung again. The house is not less holy because the wounded speak. The house is not more Catholic when it is emptier. Then came the sentence that cut both sides. If your tradition makes you despise your brother, it is not tradition, it is pride dressed in incense. If your reform makes you despise your ancestors, it is not reform. It is arrogance dressed as compassion. Several people visibly reacted. One traditionalist priest lowered his head. A progressive activist in the side aisle began crying. A bishop stared at the altar as though the marble had become a mirror. The church, Leo continued, needs neither pride nor arrogance. She needs holiness. That was the homily. No slogans, no victory, no applause line. Just a wound named aloud at the altar. After Mass, the images spread across the world. An elderly woman with a lace veil embracing a young man who had attended an LGBT Catholic listening group. A seminarian holding a Latin missal while standing beside a religious sister known for her work with migrants. A bishop from Eastern Europe speaking quietly with a survivor from Canada. A child looking up at the dome while the Agnus Dei echoed through the basilica. Critics called it theater. Supporters called it Pentecost. Leo XIV called it a beginning, and beginnings are fragile. In the weeks that followed, dioceses began to reveal what kind of church they wanted to be. Some moved quickly. Chicago announced a pilot program. Stable monthly access to the traditional Latin Mass in 3 locations, paired with diocesan listening forums on exclusion, abuse, and parish belonging. Critics mocked the pairing as artificial. But when the first forum opened, an elderly woman who attended the Latin Mass stood up and said, "I came because I want the old prayer, but if I want the church to hear me, I must learn how to hear others." That sentence stayed with everyone in the room. In Madrid, a young LGBT Catholic attended a restored sung Latin Mass out of curiosity. He understood almost nothing. Afterward, he said, "I did not understand the words, but I understood that something holy was being protected." In Krakow, a traditional priest preached that the pact did not authorize doctrinal confusion. Then he added, "But if we use doctrine to avoid seeing wounded faces, we have not defended truth, we have hidden from it." In Buenos Aires, a progressive group hosted a session on tradition and invited an old priest who celebrated the ancient rite. Half the room expected conflict. Instead, the priest began by saying, "I came to ask forgiveness for the times men like me loved rubrics more than people." A woman responded, "And I ask forgiveness for thinking every old prayer was a prison." They prayed the Our Father together. Not everything healed, but something breathed. Elsewhere, the resistance hardened. Some bishops delayed implementation, citing local circumstances. Some dioceses restored the Latin Mass, but ignored the listening forums. Others created listening forums but avoided the liturgical provisions. A few issued statements so vague that no one could tell whether they intended to obey. Rome noticed. The Pope noticed more. In the papal study, the cream folder was now full of added notes. Each diocese had a page. Some were marked with green ink, moving, some with blue, cautious, some with red, delaying. One evening, a young aide found Leo looking at the list. "Holy Father," he said, "you cannot force unity." Leo answered, "No, but I can expose refusal." That was the investigative edge of his pontificate. He did not always punish immediately. He illuminated. And for institutions accustomed to shadows, illumination can feel like punishment. 3 weeks after the pact, the first major act of resistance arrived. A group of bishops from several countries issued a public letter asking Rome to clarify whether the listening forums could lead to pastoral practices incompatible with perennial doctrine. The language was respectful. The implication was sharp. They were warning that the Pope had opened a process that could become impossible to control. 2 days later, a coalition of progressive theologians issued their own statement. They praised the listening forums but condemned the restoration of the Latin Mass as a concession to reactionary nostalgia. They argued that unity could not be built by reviving forms tied, in their view, to clerical power. Both letters reached the Pope on the same morning. He read the traditionalist concern first, then the progressive complaint. Then he reportedly laughed softly, not because it was funny, because it was exact. "They both fear being asked to love what they cannot control," he said. That afternoon, Leo XIV issued a brief note. It did not answer every objection. It said, "Every reform must kneel before truth. Every tradition must kneel before charity. Any interpretation of the pact that avoids either sentence has already betrayed the pact." That became the theological center of the entire controversy. Every reform must kneel before truth. Every tradition must kneel before charity. Some called it profound, others called it poetic evasion. But no one could avoid it, because it deprived each faction of its favorite escape. Reform without truth becomes sentiment. Tradition without charity becomes stone. The church needs neither sentiment nor stone. She needs saints. By then, the secular world had entered the debate. Governments praised the inclusion language while ignoring the Latin Mass provisions. Conservative political figures praised the Latin Mass restoration while ignoring the listening forms. Media outlets reduced the document to their preferred frame. Everyone tried to recruit the Pope. Leo refused recruitment. When a journalist asked whether the pact represented a victory for conservatives or progressives, he answered, "It represents a defeat for loneliness." That sentence did not satisfy analysts. It healed ordinary people. In a parish in the Philippines, a mother brought her daughter back to Mass after seeing the Pope's address. The daughter had not gone for 2 years. The grandfather, who loved the old rites, came too. 3 generations sat together. After Mass, the mother wrote online, "My father returned because of the Latin. My daughter returned because of the welcome. I returned because for once I did not have to choose between them." In Canada, an Indigenous Catholic community read the archive transparency provisions and asked whether unity would include historical truth. Their leader wrote to Rome, "If we are one body, then memory of harm must not be treated as division." Leo underlined that sentence. In Nigeria, a seminarian wrote in his journal, later shared anonymously, "I do not understand this Pope yet, but I think he is asking whether I want to defend the church I imagine or serve the church Christ actually gives." That may have been the deepest test, because imagined churches are easy to love. Real churches have people you did not choose. As implementation unfolded, the Vatican began receiving testimonies that did not fit any ideological narrative. A traditionalist mother from the United States wrote that the restored Latin Mass had brought her teenage son back to confession. A woman from Spain wrote that the listening forum did not change her situation, but it was the first time a bishop had listened to her without checking his watch. A priest from Poland wrote that he feared the pact, then realized his fear came partly from never having known anyone from the groups he criticized. A young Catholic from Brazil wrote, "I went to a listening session to defend doctrine. I left realizing that doctrine must have a human voice." A survivor from Ireland wrote, "Unity without truth is decoration, but truth without love is another wound." The Pope copied that last sentence into his notebook. For all the fragile signs of grace, the possibility of rupture remained. In Rome, a small but influential faction of cardinals began meeting privately. Their concern was no longer only the pact. It was Leo himself. They argued he governed through moral drama, that he placed conflicting groups together without sufficient doctrinal guardrails, that he risked making the papacy appear unstable. One of them reportedly said, "He is using the language of wounds to bypass the language of law." Another answered, "Perhaps the law has been used too often to avoid wounds." The room did not agree. They drafted questions. They discussed whether an emergency synod should be requested. Some whispered that the Pope might be creating the conditions for a formal correction. The word schism returned, softly at first, then louder. Outside, Catholic influencers made money from panic. Every day brought new videos. Rome has fallen, Latin Mass betrayed, progressives furious, Pope loses control, schism imminent. Fear became content, confusion became a business model. Leo XIV noticed that too. At a small weekday Mass, he spoke without notes. "Beware of those who sell you fear in the name of fidelity." Fear can wear vestments. Fear can quote counsels. Fear can use the word mercy. But fear does not build the church. Love does. Truth does. Sacrifice does. That homily reached fewer people than the dramatic announcements. But those who heard it remembered. Then came the quietest and perhaps most important scene of the entire pact. Several weeks after publication, Pope Leo returned alone to the chapel of Santa Marta. No photographers, no public schedule, no symbolic audience. Only one aide saw him enter. On the kneeler, he placed 3 things: a copy of the Pactum Unitatis, the old Latin missal, and the folded letter from the young Catholic who had written, I was told there was no room for someone like me unless I became invisible. For nearly an hour, the Pope prayed. When he emerged, his face looked tired but peaceful. The aide asked whether he needed anything. Leo shook his head. Then he said the sentence that would later leak and become the final question of the entire controversy. Now we will see whether we wanted unity or only victory. That is where the Church stands now. Victory is easier. Victory lets one side cheer while the other side bleeds. Victory lets traditionalists count restored masses without learning the names of the excluded. Victory lets progressives count listening forums without learning the language of inherited reverence. Victory lets bishops issue statements without changing structures. Victory lets lay Catholics perform outrage without conversion. Unity is harder. Unity asks traditionalists to surrender contempt. It asks progressives to surrender impatience. It asks bishops to surrender control. It asks lay Catholics to surrender cynicism. It asks the wounded to risk trust. It asks the comfortable to risk discomfort. It asks everyone to kneel before Christ instead of before the image of the Church they prefer. The Pact of Unity has not solved the crisis. It has revealed it. It has brought memory and wound into the same room. It has given the ancient liturgy space to breathe. It has given the excluded a chair at the table. It has given bishops deadlines. It has given Rome a mirror. And it has given every Catholic a question. Do we want communion? Or do we only want our side to win? Because the next chapter will not be written only in Vatican documents. It will be written in parishes where people who distrust each other sit in the same pew. It will be written in homes where grandparents and grandchildren try to pray together again. It will be written in bishops' offices, in listening circles, in restored liturgies, in opened archives, in financial ledgers, in tears, in confessions, and in the silence after anger finally runs out of words. No one knows whether the pact will heal the Church or expose a division too deep to mend. But one thing is clear. After the cream-colored folder reached the Pope's desk at 6:40 that morning, Rome could no longer pretend the two wounds were separate. The wound of memory, the wound of exclusion, the wound of tradition without charity, the wound of reform without truth. They were one wound, the wound of a body that had forgotten how to belong to itself. And perhaps that is why Leo XIV chose not a decree of victory, but a pact. Because a decree can command obedience, but a pact asks for the heart. And the heart is always the last territory to be converted. So now the question comes to you. Is Pope Leo XIV building the bridge the Church desperately needs? Or has he lit a fuse beneath a fragile communion? Tell us where you are watching from. Tell us whether you believe tradition and mercy can sit at the same table. And if this story challenged you, share it with someone who thinks unity is easy. Because unity is not easy. It never was. The cross was not easy either. And yet from that wood the Church was born.